All right, welcome everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to this Monday episode of Crypto with Chris. Today we're going to look at some price action. It's been a week since we did a price action video. I was out on Friday. I had some other things going on, but I was hoping over this last week that something interesting would happen. And sadly, it's just been very boring. It's so really not much at all has happened, but we'll get into it and we'll take a look at a few things and see if we can get some insight. And so, kind of over the past week, since there was not really much to look at in terms of price action, I spent a lot of that time digging into watching some videos and content, learning about the business cycle and how that really kind of informs a lot of the price action and the cyclical nature of all the different asset classes and things like that. So we're going to get into all that. But before we do, again, I always want to remind everybody to follow my Twitch channel so that you can get alerts and also so you can comment in the chat. You do have to be a follower in order to comment in the chat. I'm actually trying to get up to 50 followers so that I can level up in Twitch. And it's funny, I know that sounds so lame, but I know we all have to start somewhere, I suppose. And then lastly, follow my Telegram channel for alerts on all my upcoming shows, on all the different things that I'm doing these days. All the links for all this stuff is in all of my video comment section or description section rather, and then also in my Twitch profile. So yeah, check all that out. And then, yeah, okay, with that, let's get started. All right, so let's start with Bitcoin on the weekly. As we can see here, very boring. Pretty much nothing has happened. But there's a couple things I do want to point out, and then we'll sort of dig into some other time frames. But again, let's go back to the Bollinger Bands here. The super tight Bollinger Band has just continued on for another week, and really it's done nothing. So that's interesting. Essentially, that just means more coiling action, which just means we're in for more of a breakout. So if we zoom in on this, we can see that, technically the 10-week has inched above where price action currently sits, but we still haven't, we bounced off the 20-week here last week, and then it's closed above the 10-week. And then, just by virtue of the open being horizontal from there, the 10-week did poke up a little bit. We're still technically above the 20-week. So again, technically uptrend still in play. Structure has not been invalidated. All of that same stuff. So I know it's boring because it doesn't really look like anything happened, and technically it didn't. But nevertheless, you can't say things are going badly until they're actually going badly, and technically they're not. So that's all we have to go on right now. We can try and glean maybe which way is it going to go. One thing I kind of noticed as I was poking through some of these charts, I was looking at the Dixie, and a lot of times, equities and crypto tends to go the opposite of what the dollar is doing, and the dollar has kind of come back and hit a resistance level here. I feel like it's doing a pattern of setting lower highs and lower lows, and it has bounced back, and it kind of did bump up against this trend line, and now it's back down sort of right at this trend line. And if it continues to follow this path, which I believe is kind of the general consensus, then the Dixie will drop down, and I think that could give some fuel to crypto, fuel to stocks, and the like. But that happens slowly, and it's not going to happen overnight. So just kind of something to keep an eye on. But let's go back here and take a look at Bitcoin on the daily and see if we can see anything. It's a little bit more constructive, a little anyway. We can see we've got a couple of bearish divergence flags here, and a bear's damage flag here, but really it's not even like price is ignoring that. It's just kind of just continuing to go sideways, basically. It's as if really nothing has happened. I don't know if that comes back to my thesis that everything is just really going to continue to go sideways more or less until we get closer to this timing band for this first ETF approval window, but we'll see. So maybe the Dixie helps with that. Maybe it doesn't. But again, really, daily looks sort of ugly. Like I said in my last video, that really hasn't changed other than a couple of these, bullish divergence flags. But even as ugly as it looks, it's almost like it's starting to level off too. Oh, actually, one other thing I did want to point out on the daily or on the monthly, weekly rather, if we look at so much zoom in, if we look at these two moving averages, the 10 and the 20 week, it actually they're starting to diverge. I mean, the 20 is more or less leveling off. The 10 is still ever so slightly poking up. And if you look at this indicator, this graphical representation of this moving average divergence spread here, it technically has had two higher high candles in a row. So these averages are indeed diverging apart. And so that's sort of, another indication that short-term uptrend is still something to pay attention to. Um, in terms of the cycle, we don't really know anything there either. We have sort of a tentative high and a tentative low, tentative high at 28, day 28, tentative low at day 47. But this really isn't anything. And we're not going to know until probably sometime into the next cycle how this ultimately is going to resolve. Um, do I think it's going to come down and form a lower low than it did on day 27 as like a, bomb into a cycle low and then bounce out of that? That's always a possible scenario. Do I think it's already formed a low and we could get a surge out of that? That's possible too. It's also possible that neither one of these are the high, or I'm sorry, this isn't the high, and we'll get sort of a roundup, peaking around. Well, what day are we on here? Let's see, day 53. So we're deep into it now. Like this week, like if that's going to happen, sometime this week we could get a poke up as a new proper high in kind of the correct timing band, and then a dip down below this level here for a proper low, and then go up from there. But I mean, again, I'm not predicting anything. Who knows what it's actually going to do? Um, this doesn't tell me much now. All we can do with the cycles is kind of just use them to track what we've seen and look back at it in hindsight and sort of use that to glean what it might do going forward. Um, Outside of that, there's not a ton to look at. We can touch at Bitcoin ETH. That's been really going flat too. For a minute, ETH kind of, let's kind of zoom in on this. For a minute, ETH looked like it was maybe going to rebound, but it's just sort of leveled off. And I do think that Bitcoin still really does control the narrative. Bitcoin dominance is still continuing to go up across the board. None of the other alts are doing anything against Bitcoin, and so just the notion that it's not even yet time for ETH, I think still stands. But this is something to keep an eye on. I expect it though to pretty much either go sideways, maybe even dip back down here, or potentially come back down into this area too, like I've touched on before. Outside of that, there's not a ton going on that's interesting other than Bitcoin Cash sort of bounced, which I wasn't expecting. Um, Not that I'm going to do anything with this, but I figured this was just going to bleed out at this point. I figured this was going to be just another in a series of, pumps and dips and pumps and dips, and maybe it is. But it did bounce once it got back down to this 10-week moving average against Bitcoin and, closer to the bottom of this breakout level. Um, I still don't have any faith in this. I mean, it's a ghost chain basically, but just something interesting to keep an eye on in case TradFi wants to throw some money at it, because that could be an interesting thing to take advantage of. But outside of that, Solana's boring. I wanted to look at Optimism too, because Optimism has continued to show a little bit more strength than a lot of the alt projects out there. But like I've touched on in the past, looking at it against Bitcoin, it has come up against this 20-week moving average and has continued to get rejected so far twice now, certainly last week and already a little bit this week. So until it starts closing heavily above this, on the weekly level, and really pushing up into this range up in here, this isn't something I'm going to really consider, but it's something to keep an eye on in case it does. Um, I think outside of that, let's get into the business cycle stuff because I think this is pretty interesting. So what I want to start with is the ISM Purchasing Managers Index for the U.S. And this is one of the things that sort of factors heavily into analyzing the business cycle. And we can see here that it tends to go in, certainly since 2008 anyway. I'm not going to go back because it was all over the map much more back then. But ever since the global economic crisis that happened back in 2008, the ISM and the business cycle has been very predictable and very cyclical. And so I think this is interesting to point out because I'm going to show you how it sort of correlates to Bitcoin here in a minute. But if we look at this, we can see, yeah, they're all about 42 months. And on the top side, they top for a long time. Like, you can call these tops in a few different places, but you can also say that it's very much, a cyclical 42 months. And especially if you look at the bottoms of the dips, they're all right in a very similar range. Like, if we move in from the beginning of these cycles to the middle, this peaked, or this bottomed rather, in 21 months. This one was a little early in 17 months. This one was 22 also. Granted, it bottomed here and had started to reverse back up, but then we had COVID sort of come out of nowhere and drop it back down, and then it immediately recovered. So I'm not really counting this as the low because it had already started its bottoming pattern in the typical time frame that it does, and had gone up before get blasted out by COVID. That brings us to now. We're actually right at about we're at month 23, and we did get a low last month that was a lower low, and now we're above that. So it looks like we are coming into what could be a bottoming pattern. And certainly we're in the timing band for that too. And so this is going to kind of lead all of everything. This is basically telling you that manufacturing is picking up, that businesses are picking up, that more activity is happening across the board. And when we have that, that pretty much funnels out into everything, and it just means more money everywhere. And so if we go back and look at what that looks like on the Bitcoin chart, um, well, first let's talk about, well, yeah, here, let me add this. Okay, so we got manufacturers index. So I'm just gonna, this is the same chart overlaid on top of the current Bitcoin chart. Make sure it's lined up. And if we look, we'll just look at the last few cycles. We can see that, like I mentioned, the PMI does go through a topping sort of arcing pattern for a much longer period of time than, say, Bitcoin does. Bitcoin really just peaks and then and then drops again. Um, I mean, it really, and it's funny, this one, it was peaking, still peaking all the way almost through the Bitcoin bear market. So it's hard to gauge that, but we can look in a general sense, this peaked, and it's very much in line with Bitcoin peaking and rolling over, and then dropping down again. And then particularly in this last cycle, very interesting coming out of COVID, um, it really launched up. And interestingly too, it peaked right at the exact same time as the first big Bitcoin peak, really the big main Bitcoin peak that we had. The PMI peaked also and then dropped down. And then it did come up and kind of form not quite as high of a high, but it did sort of fuel this run up here to a degree. And this last peak does coincide perfectly with Bitcoin's final peak before also just bottoming out again. And then we do see it starting to roll over. A couple of interesting things I've noticed here. If we look at this, these bottoms, right now, this bottom almost perfectly coincides. The bottom and the first run up out of the bottom perfectly coincides with Bitcoin doing its sort of last touch on this 2-year moving average multiplier before it, kind of ran up into its bull run. And then if we go to the same one, sort of the same thing. It basically, it could have been this first one because it touched here and then it pumped up here, and this would have been the last time that it touched this line. But then we had COVID, so it bottomed out again, came back down, crossed over. But then again, as soon first move up here, the last time it crossed over here. So it's pretty good at sort of calling bottoms, I think, and coinciding. And then if we come to right now, we're sort of seeing something very similar. We're seeing, hopefully this is the final bottom. We're right along the, getting close to crossing up over this line here, and we're starting to move up here. So we could see a crossover here where it just kind of goes up and doesn't look back and kind of, pushes us into the later stages of the accumulation phase and up into the bull phase. So we're very much right in the window for I think a lot of this to happen. Um, and I know I've shown too in the past. Let's see, let me unhide these date ranges here too. From the first crossover to the last crossover. We had 16 months this first time around, 17 months the second time around, though it would have been shorter were it not for COVID. And then currently we're at month 15. So all this, again, right in the timing band for things to roll over, and this sort of bottoming pattern that we're seeing here on the PMI is sort of telling us that it's not just crypto, but it's sort of everything. It's all of the entire business cycle that is ready to roll back up and go on another run. And then if we add in the central bank balance sheets, the global central bank liquidity from the kind of top five central banks, that tells an interesting picture too. Let me get rid of these guys again. Um, Similar. I feel like actually here, let's get rid of this one just for a cleaner look. This actually follows, I feel like, certainly Bitcoin, the Bitcoin chart, a little more accurately or closely, rather. This one peaked. It's a little bit sharper of a peak. You can't use this as a leading indicator, you could say, because certainly Bitcoin peaked and was starting to roll over before this peaked here. Um, and then the same thing here. Bitcoin peaked both times really before this started to roll over. But on the upside, it's more telling. It does act more of a leading indicator on the bottom, less of a leading indicator on the top side. But just like we were showing with the PMI, this was really starting to kick off and show that liquidity, that the balance sheet was increasing basically across the board on a net level globally. And then it rounded off here, and then particularly with COVID too. Really, this sort of front ran the COVID crash. Even, I mean, we had the bottom, and by this month, we were already a month up into major money printing, major QE coming into the system already, even though it was sort of, like I said, a month before the COVID crash. And by this month here, 2 months in, it's already just surging. And so again, this really would have been a big time, it's time to buy indicator if you weren't there already. And that continued to play out. And so if we go to where we are right now, um, sort of similar, although it has leveled off again. But it on a net level, it's slowly ticking upwards at least. If you look at it on the weekly level, it is down this week and kind of down last week. But on a net level, on a monthly level, it is going up, and it is kind of going sideways, and is sort of reflective of the sideways market. But um, this more is reflective of what the Fed is doing and with the interest rates and with their quantitative tightening and reducing their balance sheet right now and things like that. Like if we look at the Fed balance sheet, I think I have here. We can see that they are still in the process of reducing their balance sheet somewhat. So there's other banks, particularly China right now, that is putting money into the system, and I think that's where we're getting this sort of net gain. But in terms of the U.S. specifically, we are seeing that it's leveling off, and they're not actually putting money into the system at the moment. Um, but if we come back here, we got a net gain, and I do think that inflation is down, and at some point, sooner or later, sooner rather than later, I think, I believe the Fed's going to at least pause, and then eventually they'll have to start lowering, because that's really sort of just how the cycle works. I mean, it's sort of a rinse and repeat kind of thing. If you go back and look at this, like a lot of these things are interest rates going up and down, and actually I had a chart of, and well, no, I don't have it queued up, but I have a chart of interest rates, and I should overlay that on top of this, and I bet it would be pretty interesting. Well, here, maybe I can just add it as a second pane and see if we can look at it. Uh, Wait, that's right here. Um, well, yeah, it's tricky because it was sideways this whole time, and it was zero, pretty much zero interest this whole time. But certainly we can see that it's peaked out here, and it's going to start leveling off, and these two are going to start corresponding with each other. But that wasn't as compelling as I was hoping it would be. Anyway, so yeah, interesting stuff. I think with the business cycle and with the liquidity cycle, there's a lot going on right now that is looking like, we're in a bottoming pattern, that I think is going to, push all assets up going forward, and it's kind of perfectly in alignment with the Bitcoin, 4-year cycle at the moment. And Yeah, I mean, so overall it looks good. I mean, I'm super bullish because of all this. I think that this bodes well for the next few years, but right now it's just super boring. I feel like this cycle is so much more like the 20, 15, 16, 17 cycle than this last one. This last one was kind of a major roller coaster. We came barreling up out of here, and then, 6 months of nothing. Then we had this wild COVID crash with this huge black swan, dip, and then we had the halving sort of right around here, and price kind of went sideways and down for a little bit after that, and then it was just off to the races. Whereas back here, it was just slow grind, a little bit, and then, correction. And it was a lot more like what we're seeing now. So, all this to say that this isn't what we have now isn't really atypical, other than we did have a much bigger dip, than previous ones and for longer. But um, you know, if we look at the business cycle, if we look at the liquidity cycle, all of this looks good, and I think that the future's bright for Bitcoin across the board. And really, like I've been saying, it's just going to come down to these ETFs in the time being. This is what's driving the narrative, um, and and then we'll see what happens once this deadline hits, if they do or don't approve it, and go from there. So yeah, kind of just a quick update. That's really all I had for today. Um, Probably on Wednesday, I'm going to have another guest on, I hope. I need to kind of reach out to a couple different people. We might actually continue our conversation I had with Kwakadaka last Wednesday, because I realized after ending that episode, even though we went on for 90 minutes, that we didn't really cover a lot of the, this bit here, the bear market, and, timing our exits and how we played all of this, and what that looked like. So, and I feel like there's a lot of lessons that were learned in this process too. So I'd like to come back and go over that. And even if I don't have him on, I may just spend the time going through that myself, and sort of talking about what lessons I learned in that scenario, and what I can look back at the chart and see, and that kind of thing. So that's what we're going to talk about on Wednesday. I think it should be interesting. I think these kinds of episodes are super helpful for especially newer entrants into the space, because this is stuff that you don't know until you just experience it. And so I think if you can kind of get a sense of what you wish you would have known, back then, at the beginning, then I think you'll be that much better off. So stay tuned for that. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So again, thanks for watching if you did, and see you guys on Wednesday. All right.